Back a year ago.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Beer Bound podcast. We're very excited to be joined by Ellen Goldstein, author of Stuff Every Beer Snob Should Know. Ellen was born and raised in Charlottesville, Virginia. She received her MFA in poetry from Emerson College. Her poetry and essays have been published in journals such as Measure, StorySouth, Post Road, The Common, Tahoma Literary Review, Lunch Ticket, and elsewhere. She currently lives in Southern Vermont. We look forward to speaking to Ellen to learn more about her career in writing and editing and her love of craft beer to boot. So without further ado, we welcome Ellen to the Beer Bound podcast. Ellen, how are you doing?
I'm good. I'm happy to be here.
Well, thanks for joining us this evening. Well, Ellen, I gave a little sort of brief introduction about you, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit, just give us a bit more sense on your professional career as a writer, and then maybe we'll get into the good stuff of beer in a few minutes. But who are you?
Always the question, right? I am a writer and editor. I have an MFA in poetry, which is one of the very most useful degrees a person can get. So I earn my living editing because that's what I do. And I lucked into writing a book about beer, which was just the best job I've ever had. And I would do it again in a second. And that's sort of the brief rundown of my career.
So you do an MFA in poetry, which is pretty exciting. And then you sort of use that as a leverage point into a bit of a writing career and a bit of an editing career. What does that mean for people who don't really know being a writer and an editor? What's the difference?
Well, it's different for everyone. I can tell you sort of my writing career, how that kind of came about. I was one of those kids who always wanted to be a writer. And for some reason, I was like, I think I'll be an editor when I grow up, because I thought that meant you read all day, which is actually true. You do read all day. But I think I also thought I was going to read novels I like all day, which is not what you tend to do when you're editing. The dream is like you're reading these beautiful literary novels and famous people, but really that's not how it goes. I edited science journals, I've edited engineering journals, all sorts of crazy stuff. And so I went a pretty traditional route. I was an English major in college. And then when I graduated, I was like, well, I should probably get a job in publishing. But I was in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and there weren't very many publishing jobs. So I ended up working in an independent bookstore. And that was really great because it gave me this just huge breadth of knowledge about books. And for like 7 years, every time someone talked about a book they were reading, I knew what it was, just because that's what booksellers are like. But eventually I was like, maybe I want something more professional. And I decided to go get an MFA, which again is not a very practical decision. And you shouldn't do unless you're funded, because you can't really get that money back. But it was a really great experience. So I spent 2.5 years in Boston taking writing workshops and experimenting with different kinds of poetry and reading things I'd never read before. So it was a great education. It was very practical in terms of writing, not in general, because workshops, you just sit there, you write, you critique, you read more, you write more, you critique more, and it was super fun. I also took a copy editing class at the time, because the grad program I went to had a publishing track. Your options are kind of to teach, which I didn't want to do, or work in publishing. There are other things you could do, but those seemed like my two options. And so I definitely went with the publishing. And so I learned how to copy edit. Lots of people who are good at words have the ability to edit, but sort of the act of editing, there's a lot of formalities and ways of doing it that you actually have to learn. People used to ask me, I want to be, I was an English major, I would like to edit. And it's like, that's great. But there's a lot of things about consistency and a whole bunch of things that no one on this podcast wants to hear about that a person has to pay attention to when they're editing. So I got my first copy editing job at a science journals, the meteorologists. So I was editing all this PhD level stuff, classic English major. I had no idea what I was doing, but that was the point. Like, I was there to do grammar and format and stuff like that. It was okay. And then after a while, I got a job at a craft book publisher. I'm not a crafty person, but there you go. Because again, you edit all these things that you don't do, you're not interested, it's fine, they're paying you. And so that was actually really great because it indirectly led to my beer book. And also, I had a really difficult boss, which inspired me to go freelance. So I'm really grateful for her because I really loved being freelance for many years. And that's where I was just editing anything and writing when I could. Sort of the hard thing about poetry is nobody pays you to write poetry ever. So you're always doing something else.
It's an
Novelists
interesting,
and
it's an
yeah,
interesting field. I guess it's not, I guess some people do get paid to write poetry.
Billy Collins, maybe. A lot of people are paid to teach poetry, and that's how a lot of poets make a living, or they just do something else.
For sure. Okay, so to expand a little bit on a career in publishing now, I mean, so even if you are editing text that you don't really know the content of, you really just are focused the on the English language component of it, on the grammar, on whether or not the diction makes sense, the sentence structure makes sense. That's what you have a narrow focus in that regard, or is there a little bit of an expectation on your end that you do know a little bit about biology or crafts or whatever the topic is?
It depends on what you're editing. When you're editing science journals, they always have, how it tends to work is there's the English majors who do for language, and then the content editors who are professionals in the field and make sure the English majors don't screw anything up. But what's really amazing, I worked in the same journal, the Journal of Atmospheric Sciences, and so you get really familiar with things even if you don't know exactly what they are. For example, the Coriolis effect, if I'm pronouncing that right, Coriolis is always capitalized, and I just know that. I'm not sure. I couldn't tell you what it is. I think it has to do with wind because it all has to do with wind and the clouds. I'm not really sure. So you get really familiar, and it's a little like reading a foreign language. It's very strange, but you understand how words are used even if you don't know what they mean. They're always nouns. They're always verbs. They're always spelled a certain way, capitalized a certain way. And so it's an odd thing. Not everybody can get into that mindset, even editors. But I really liked it. I'm not sure why. And you'll also get a lot of scientists who English isn't their first language, and sometimes there's more heavy lifting you do there because there are more grammatical errors. Not that native speakers don't have grammatical errors too. So it
certainly do. Ellen, what interests you in poetry to begin with? What is it about poetry that made you decide you wanted to study it? Certainly at a very high level of getting a master's degree. What is the attraction that poetry has to you?
Yeah, when I was a kid, I always thought I'd be a novelist because that's just what I read. But then, I wrote some poetry and I wrote some extraordinarily bad fiction. And then I realized I was taking a lot of poetry classes in literature because my college didn't have a whole lot in creative writing. I was like, wow, I keep taking these, I had to take a class in the Romantic period. I took romantic poetry, I kept choosing poetry. I was like, well, that's really interesting. And then I took a poetry class my senior year in college, and I was just really good at it. That sounds really vain, but I really liked it. I had a good sense for it. I received praise on it. And I think that's a lot of why people follow what they do, is because they just fall into it and it's good and you're good at it. My sort of more adult reason I like poetry, I love the sort of the economy of language. I love that two people can read a poem and get two different things out of it. And they're both correct. It might, one might not be what the poet exactly meant, but you as a listener can listen to poems and you're like, wow, that image made me think of something else. And you have this sort of engaged experience. And it's not just one way. You know what I mean? Like, you're not wrong if you sort of take it off and apply it to an experience you've had in your own life or relate it to something else. So it's a really interesting interaction. And above all, I just love language. And so it's a really fun way to mess with language. How do I say this without saying it the way I would in person, in prose, talking it out? And like, what does this make me think of? And I've got a mind that makes a lot of connections. And so I can just follow those connections and it's super fun.
Well, why do you think this is maybe a question that's a little bit too hypothetical, but why do you think that poetry now in the 21st century, why has poetry, I don't know, why is it not as in vogue, perhaps one could say, in the 21st century as it was maybe 100 years ago or maybe 150 years ago?
No, that's a really good question. I hate to blame high school English teachers. I really do, because there were some really great high school English teachers out there, and I kind of now feel like a jerk. But I think sort of this idea that you have to have one meaning, one literary device. I still remember the pickle dish when I read Ethan Frome in 10th grade. You know what I mean? Like, what did that pickle dish mean? And now that I'm a writer, I understand that sometimes you just say things, it just comes out and it's part of it, and there's a meaning that the the reader might get that you maybe didn't even intend. But I think people think it's a puzzle and that they have to get the right answer, and that if they don't quite understand it, people feel like they're not good at it or inferior, or but it's not a puzzle with with one right answer. It's an experience. So I think it's largely a perception of what poetry is and how you should read it. And I think there's also sort of a mystique. Poets talk to the clouds. I'm actually a mystique buster. I don't believe in that. Like, I'm not somehow more connected to the universe than any other person, but sometimes people are like, oh, you're a poet. You know, it's the way my brain works. I write concisely. I like making weird connections. I think it's just people find it kind of elite because they don't know how to listen for it and listen for what they want to take out of it. It can be very approachable and can be very meaningful. I mean, people still listen to songs, and I think poetry and songs, I think obviously they're kind of the same, but you listen to a song and a lyric really catches you and it's super meaningful because of something that you're thinking or feeling or that's happened in your life. I think it's the same for poetry. You just have to kind of let go and not expect to understand every single thing or understand exactly how it all fits together.
Yeah, I read somewhere, you touched on it a little bit, that the medium of music sort of ate the medium of poetry a little bit, certainly in popular culture, maybe. Like, I don't know if that even makes sense, but
no, it
in
totally
terms
does.
of, music is sort of now a mixture of, like, I mean, if you listen to classical composers, there's often not lyrics built into their musical pieces. It really is about the actual instrumental pieces. And now when we think of music, it's sort of a combination of the two. It's the instrumental pieces as well as the poetry sort of blended in. Do you buy that? Do you think that we still have poetry, it's just in music, and that we just don't really lean back too much on poetry enough just for poetry's sake?
I mean, I think it's hard for me to answer because I have poetry that isn't music. But I do think a lot of people find what they used to get out of poetry. I think that's a good guess in songs and in music. One of my friends, actually, the smartest woman I went to college with, she used to say the sonneteers turned into songwriters. So she's right there with you.
The sonneteers, I love it. Yeah, I used to like poetry a lot more, and it's unfortunate that artistic format just isn't really, it's not in my life as much. And now that I'm talking to you, I lament a little bit. It's sad to not have it, because I don't know, maybe we're just sort of in a lull in popular culture. Maybe I don't know what I'm talking about. Maybe poetry still is like really big, like, and I just goes above my head. Maybe I'm totally wrong about this.
It's big if you're in it. I'm not sure the average person thinks it's big, but there's a lot of poetry. What I find really exciting about poetry these days is it's a lot more inclusive. You have a lot of people writing about a lot of different things, and a lot of people from a lot of different backgrounds. And so I feel like it's very easy to sort of dip your toe in, just, I'm on Twitter partially because the poets are so interesting. I learned about new poetry. And so there's a whole lot of poetry I don't like. And so there's a lot of just finding the poets who really speak to you and following them and see who they talk about or who they read. You can always come back. Just walk into a good bookshop and see what strikes you, and pick up a book.
Is Twitter used by poets like as a platform to just put out their poetry?
Maybe. A lot of people use it sort of professionally to post other people's poems. Poets are very good at 140 characters.
Shifting a little bit from poetry to publishing, can you talk a little bit, Ellen, about your experience a little bit deeper into publishing? So that's also an interesting industry now that we're just so half or more of our lives is spent in the digital world now. How has publishing shifted in your professional career? Is it still similar as it always has been, just maybe in a more online digital format, or are things really changing, and are they really being shaken up you in
It's
in
hard for me to
2022?
say because I've actually jumped between different kinds of work. So for scientific publishing is it's quicker than it used to be, but the scientific journals are scientific journals. Although when I first started, I edited on paper, which nobody does anymore. And like 6 months into it, we went to digital, we went to online, and there was some kicking and screaming, not by me, but I have terrible handwriting, so it's actually a really good career choice for me.
Yeah,
no one can tell anymore.
It's a big bonus for me too. I have a terrible, my penmanship is atrocious. So the keyboard is my friend.
For sure. Bookstores have been totally affected by a lot of online stuff. So a lot of independent bookstores have gone out of business. So that part of my sort of proto publishing career. I don't know what the craft book industry is like these days. I was 2008, 2011 was kind of my craft book heyday. I feel like a lot of that now is content you can get online. And so I'm not 100% sure how people are keeping up with that. But yeah, I think publishers are used to being, actually, that's not really true. I was gonna say sometimes they're used to being flexible, but some of them are total stick in the mud and they're not flexible at all. So I'm actually not sure I even believe that. So people will strike that from the record. Well, I don't know if I answered the question. I think I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's tough to say. I mean, every single industry has definitely been affected by the technological age we're all in. So, I mean, publishing is interesting. From an outsider perspective, I would think, just because when you think of traditional publishing, you think of pen and paper and you think of print, but I'm sure that's like everything else, it has a digital form, I'm sure. I mean, people still, in terms of, and we can get to this more, in terms of the texts you've written, like in terms of sales and people interested, are virtual versions of your texts, like or in the publishing space entirely, like is it mostly digital copies that are selling nowadays, or not necessarily?
I don't know what's selling. So what's interesting about my book, and I'm going to show it just so you understand the scope of it. It's rather small, and it's what you call a gift book. And this is not it's $10. It's not like super nicely. I mean, it's a very nice copy, but it's not a super durable binding. And so gift books, I'm impressed that gift books are still being published, because they were the things up at the register that you would be buying other books and you'd be like, oh, that looks cute. We had I was in a Jewish neighborhood where I worked at one of the bookstores, and there was like haikus for Jews, and people would just be like, oh, that's great, I'm gonna give it to my grandma. Or haikus for cats, or like what I hate about my job. I don't know, like all of these just little gimmicky things. And I think the internet probably has taken a pretty large bite out of that kind of book. On the other hand, I feel like my beer book, although it is a gift book, has a little more meat to it, not to mix my metaphors. So there's more content there. It was definitely sold as a digital book as well. I don't have access to sales, so I don't know what sold more.
In terms of like your professional editing, like your freelance jobs that you have, are you aware of where those are distributed? Like, I guess I guess now there's always a digital copy to everything. Is that fair to say, or not necessarily?
Many things, yeah. I do a lot of academic editing, and so that's different. I'm working with writers directly. I now work on curriculum. I actually have a full-time job for once, first time in many years. And a lot of that, we're actually digitizing that. There's going to be, we've got sort of, instead of having textbooks, there's like just one teacher's edition that the teacher teaches from, and there are also workbooks, but we're developing this huge digital version of all of it. So teachers can just use a nicer form of it's not PowerPoint, but like slides with the content. And especially with kids, especially with the pandemic and the lockdown and virtual schooling, that we're hoping that's going to shift right into the market.
This is all very interesting. I feel very stupid because I don't know a lot about this industry, but I am fascinated particularly in publishing, just because I think, like all industries, in this one in particular, just sort of the changing and the revolving of everything, just to keep up with how fast things are moving. It's enlightening to me to sort of learn just about the changing in this industry. Now, maybe touching on your texts, Ellen. So can you tell us again exactly what you've published, what works you've actually sent out to the world for us to read?
This is my only book, Stuff Every Beer Snob Should Know. I have published a bunch in literary journals, poetry and prose. I have 2 unpublished books. I'm working on a 3rd. They're more of a literary bent. And so no one's paid me to do that yet. So that's continual works in progress. When I was working on this beer book, I had 3, I had a job at a college. And so I was always hauling all of my stuff because I had time between tutoring and classes and stuff. And I turned to one of my colleagues. I was like, I have 3 book manuscripts in my bag right now. Like I had a little bit of poetry I was doing, and I had this nonfiction book I'd been working on, and then I had the beer book.
That's so interesting. So Stuff Every Beer Snob Should Know. When was that published, Ellen?
It was published in 2018. I started working on it, I believe, in 2016, and then turned it in early 2017. It was published 2018. 2018.
So you told me that was a professional writing job. What does that mean?
It means I don't own the copyright. And so it means, so the publisher owns the copyright. It's actually a series. It's stuff every fill in the blank should know. It's like grandparents and college students and gardeners and cooks, and the beer snob and the wine snob came out at the same time. Someone on Goodreads was like, I don't know why they were written by 2 different authors. That's because I know nothing about wine and no one asked me about it. I like wine, but it's not my, So what it means is that I was hired for my writing skills rather than my beer expertise. And it's partially because it's a gift book. I'm not going to huge depth. I actually don't need to be a total expert in order to write it, because it's a short book and they're short pieces in a short book. So I was hired for my ability to write. And also really, I kind of suspect for my understanding of publishing, like I wasn't going to kick up a fuss. I wasn't going to be, difficult about people changing words. Like I knew how it went. So when you're writing creative writing, your voice, your style, what you write about is so very important because it's who you are as a writer. And so you really can push back. So in literary publishing, the writer is more, not totally in charge, but kind of a little more, has more creative control, because how they say things and what they say is super important. So in a professional writing job, really the publisher had the creative control. I had a lot of creativity and I had a lot of latitude, but they had the final say, and they edited it a whole lot. There's a chapter I didn't even write in here. So when I got it, I was like, I don't remember writing about bottles and cans. So they probably decided after, I was paid a lump sum to write it. And so probably afterwards they were like, oh, we should add that. And so they just found someone who would write that, or maybe they wrote it themselves. I don't actually know. I was basically given a table of contents and a word count. And they were like, all right, we want you to write, 250 to 500 words, which is 1 or 2 manuscript pages, give or take, on each thing. And so it was this really great creative challenge. Because I was like, how am I going to, stuff all this info in my head, the stuff I didn't know? How am I going to organize it? How am I going to do it? And so we really had a lot of back and forth. I suggested some sections that they did add, and I tried to get some sections taken out, which they didn't do, but that's fine. I really didn't want to do beer cocktails, but I did beer cocktails. I took one for the team. Yeah, so it was, they had the final say. Like it was really clear that I was there to write to their specs. It was a job. It wasn't while it was super creative, it was not my sole creative project, which was fine. It was a fun process.
Did you do a lot of research in order to get up to speed with the content? I mean, you have Ellen, you've expressed to me that you are a beer fan. So I suspect you knew a little bit or perhaps a medium amount of content. Was there a large process for you in order to brush up on all the content towards what everything that a beer snob should know about?
Yes, there was. So I was a beer snob. So I had that down pat, right? I had how this whole thing came about, and I hope this doesn't sound too insidery, but I'd worked at the scrapbook publisher, and one of my colleagues became an acquisitions editor. I had her over for dinner one night because we were friends. And, I was like, do you want something to drink? And, go through that whole thing. And she wanted a beer. What kind of beer do you like? I don't know. You don't know. So I got to matchmake her with a beer, which is one of my favorite things to do. Cool. I don't even remember what beer it was, but evidently that made an impression because a couple years later, I got this email. We'd been actually trying to figure out a book we could write together. I mean, her as an editor and me as a writer. Acquisitions editors are people who do research and go out and try to find the people to write the books and the books that they want to carry. And so they're always presenting these book ideas in proposal form, which is this kind of like a market plan and a summary rather than the whole book itself, to their editorial overlords, and editorial overlords will take it or not take it. And so we proposed a couple books to her overlords and they did not take it, but they took this one. And so I was like, oh shit, I have a beer contract. I have a book. I need to learn how to brew beer because I knew very little about brewing beer. Mm-hmm. Not that I brewed beer. So that was actually, when you're a freelancer, you take your lump sum and you break it down. You're paid $500 to edit a certain number of pages. You break down how many hours you think it's going to take. You figure out your hourly rate and you put in about as much effort as you can to do a good job. If they're paying more, you probably do an extra amazing job. And if they're paying you less, you do an adequate job. Because otherwise you're working for 2 cents an hour all of the time. Maybe some people do that, but I try not to. But sometimes you have a project where either you're not quite at the level you need to be, or you just love it. And so I'm sure I worked 2 cents an hour for this job. No regrets, but I also had this huge learning curve. So, I read a little bit about brewing beer, and I'm not a super technically minded human being. And I was like, I'm not ready yet. So I started with beer styles, and I knew a lot about beer styles, but I don't know all the beer styles. I only know the ones I like. And so, there I was in the good beer store in town, in the international beer section, going through the dust to get like box and double box and all these beers I'm not super into, all these German lagers that I really is not my cup of beer, not my kind of beer. But I had to try them because I had to write about them. You can read descriptions. I did a lot on craftbeer.com, which is just an amazing resource. Amazing. They saved my life. And, at a certain point, you're like, okay, I understand what they're saying, but I don't have my own experience of it. And so, you don't want to plagiarize. So you have to go. So I had to go do some field research, and obviously the field research was the most fun.
Can you expand on the field research? I might have an idea as to what you're talking about.
Yeah. So for learning how to brew, I read a lot of books. I watched a lot of videos. But the field research, pretty much I called up my best friend and I was like, you're coming to the bar with me because I need some company. And I had these like targeted approaches. I would go to the best beer bar in the area. At the time I lived outside of Boston. So I had a lot of options in Boston and out of Boston. Sure. She's sitting there. It's like a December afternoon and she's drinking her hoppy beers, which is always what she likes. And I'm like, well, here's my German Pilsner. Okay, I'll drink some. And so I was drinking all these beers that I wasn't super interested in. Well, she just laughed at me, but she was very good company. Then we kind of toddled home. I lived within walking distance of this bar. So, it's kind of swaying home. I also had to practice drinking beer critically. Previously, I would just be like, oh, this is good. I like it. It's got a weird aftertaste. I don't like it so well. So I had to brush up on sort of the formal ways of tasting and trying out beer, which was super great. And I love that process of even just learning it and then applying it in the field. I talked everyone's ear off about beer all of the time. I asked them what they liked, what they didn't like. My brother-in-law is a huge beer fan. He knows way more than I do. Fortunately, he doesn't write, so he wasn't competition. So I talked to him a bunch and we went out together and I would, we would try all different things, and I would sip his beer. So this was pre-COVID. I would sip his beer, so I knew what kind of he was doing, and I got a much wider sense. And so then I could write about these styles that I didn't know so well because I had tried them.
Ellen, did you discover in your field research any particular styles that you weren't too crazy about prior, but you developed an appreciation or perhaps a love for?
It turns out I like the wheat beer. Who knew? I've always been I started out as a stout person. I would drink Guinness because I thought that made me cool. I also liked it. So I wasn't just being pretentious. I was being pretentious and enjoying myself. And then I morphed into IPAs and stuff. So I was all like dark beer and IPAs, and get this pale stuff away from me. I'm not saying that. So yeah, wheat beer. I love the mouthful of wheat beer. I don't like, the Hefeweizен's a little light, so it's kind of the wheat beer. There's some other outliers that I had known. I had some barley wine. Barley wine's actually really quite tasty. But it made me more appreciative, even though I probably still order similar things than I used to. But I'm not so dismissive.
All right, so you're a bit more into experimenting now. Maybe you could say that.
Yeah.
Okay, so Ellen, so you do the field research, do quite a bit of, sounds like you did a lot of research, not only in the field, but also online and reading lots of text. Did you do any brewing yourself?
No, the brewing was the hardest part for me because it's, very technical, and it was hard because it was a little new to me and very chemistry intensive. I had to read a bunch of things to kind of nail down what was going on, and to write about it in a really accessible way in a really short amount of text. You kind of have to understand something really well to write about it in an accessible way. And so I know I don't have the patience to brew beer. I know people experiment and change little things with the parameters, and that's just not who I am as a person.
It's funny. This is a bit of a stereotype, but I'll say it anyway. Yeah. Like when we often, with my colleague Garrett and I, we see craft brewers, like people who are interested in brewing, kind of as an interesting figure, because you associate craft beer as being a very social, very warm sort of gathering entity. But a craft brewer, if he or she is a really good brewer, we sometimes think they're probably more of like an introvert. They like spending time alone, like in the back. They don't get any praise. They're probably science focused, interested in the actual chemistry of it all. So it's kind of an interesting dichotomy that, again, maybe a stereotype. We've met brewers that are very social and extroverted, but it's kind of interesting.
It is kind of interesting. Yeah. I prefer my introversion to do with words. It's more my speed. Yeah, I'd buy it.
Yeah. Just a theory with not a whole lot of evidence, but it's my theory. Well, okay,
crackpot theories. Yeah.
There you go. Yeah. So Alan, so how many pages is the book?
Printed out, it is 143 pages.
Yeah. Okay. So not like super small. We've interviewed I don't know if you're aware of Jeff Allworth. He wrote the Beer Bible. I think that's like
that was part of my research. Yes.
Yeah. It's a great text. I think it's like 600, 700 pages, something like that. And I think, and it covered a lot, obviously. So every beer snob should know. I mean, I venture that maybe it was a little bit different, a little bit difficult rather for you to focus on a small amount of things to focus on, because if you're a true beer snob, maybe you should have a beer Bible sized text. But how did you condense your work into less than 150 pages? Was that difficult?
Well, I write short because I'm a poet. So that was actually a strength that I don't think they knew going in. It's just how I am. And I did have this table of contents, which I don't know if you want to see. I mean, you can see.
Please.
You can tell,
I have read some. I have the online version, so I did read some of it online. Yeah.
And so I had really clear parameters. I had, again, 250 to 500 words per section, which is one or two typewritten pages, double spaced.
Yeah.
So what you do when you need to write short is you write long and then you cut back. because you have to kind of figure out all the stuff you're thinking and all the stuff you have to say, and then you're like, wait, what's the part I actually need? And here's where the editor came in really handy, because some of my editing and teaching background is in academic writing.
Right.
Sometimes I get over focused on the accuracy of things. I mean, I think it all should be accurate, but sometimes I'm like, for example, the source of IPA, like where did the name IPA came from, or how did IPAs come about, is debated. And
Yes.
so part of me wanted to lay down like, this person said this and that person said this and this, but that's not the kind of book I was writing. So there's a lot of I had to figure a workaround, so I wouldn't go down these just crazy rabbit holes that you would do if you were writing the beer Bible. But since I was writing the beer light, I would be like, some people say blah, 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 blah. And then I could present the fact as not quite a fact, or not as I could live with myself. And I also felt like I was presenting, if not accurate information that people believed, or that, is repeated around many places.
Accurate enough. Yeah.
Accurate enough. Yeah.
Alan, sorry. Alan, did you do any, like when you're hired for a contract text, is it any responsibility that you have to do any of the editing? Like, do you edit your own stuff and then you send it off and then it gets edited again? Or do you send, or the editing process isn't too much on your shoulders for something like this?
I did a lot of editing. So how it worked was I can't remember. I had like 6 weeks to do the first half, which was 7,500 words. And I knew the first half. One of the things about having written a lot is I sort of understand what my process is. And I knew the first half was going to be hard because, I was just starting out. I needed to figure out like my tone. I needed to figure out what I was writing about. I needed to figure out what I knew, what I didn't know. And so I wrote it partially over Christmas at my sister-in-law's house with like triplet boys running around and 5 TVs on, 3 dogs, and my brother-in-law being like, could you finish work so we could go drink some beer? So the first draft was really chaotic. I went down some of those rabbit holes, but I knew I was going to need to edit more. But this is what's so great about editors is it was so much fun because as a copy editor, you're like, I need to make sure I capitalize Maybach the same every time. But as a writer, you're like, that's the copy editor's problem. It's totally freeing. I knew I was going to get a lot of edits back. And I did. She sent it back and it was just, I don't know if you're familiar with track changes, but it in Word, whatever, it was covered in the digital equivalent of red ink. In the beginning, even if you expect it, it's a little bit, it takes you aback. You're like, oh no, maybe I'm not doing the job right. And then this is the way of getting writing criticism, and probably any kind of criticism. And then you kind of calm down. You're like, no. She's probably saying some really good things. And so you kind of take a deep breath and go through slowly. And I had to, she rewrote a lot, and she rewrote it in her own words, which are not necessarily my words. Mm-hmm. So that I just had to be like, nope, that's how we're doing it. This is not my, it's not my copyright. The word wacky is used like 15 times. I never use that word, but that's fine. So I did a lot of rewriting for that. I think I did 2 whole rewrites for that. And, she caught me, I got into like super detail about Mexican loggers and Viennese or Austrian immigrants. And because it's really interesting to me, but it's way too much detail. She's like, calm down with that. It's like, okay. But she said it very nice because editors are extremely diplomatic, nuanced people whose job is to just be extremely diplomatic about it. Someone says something truly terrible and you're like, this could be perceived as offensive to a few people. I know you didn't mean to. Consider rephrasing. It's just this very indirect way of communicating, but it also protects the writer's poor sensitive nerves, which is great.
Sure. Yeah. Well, the writer is the artist, right? Yeah. You have to be careful. Well, is that for something like this? As a writer, does this sort of situation bother you a little bit? Probably you do lose some of your artistic freedom in what you want to do, but I guess that it's kind of true for anything that you're doing. Like everything always gets edited and there's always suggestions made. So Was this was this a restricting process for you? Were you happy with the end result? How did that go?
Yes, I was definitely happy with the end result. Well, publishing is a collaborative process, and I've been on both sides of that. The publisher needs the book that they think they can sell and that fits in their brand, and the writer needs to do what they feel is best, but they also are not self-publishing, so they need to also negotiate with the publisher's needs. And so it's always like this little back and forth. In the beginning, I probably during that first editing process, I was like, okay, this is how it's going. Like, this is really different than how I wrote it. But that's okay. Like, I just had to just understand that this was the process. No one would do that to your poems because nobody edits poems that heavily.
Right.
And so, but a gift book that, and the copyright's not mine, they do. And so I was fine with it. I pushed back sometimes if there was something that bothered me, but I let go the idea that it needed to be entirely my voice. I would say that was a little bit difficult in the beginning, but then it was fine because I sort of got used to it. I was like, okay, this is the voice of the book and it's going to be consistent. And, I wrote 90% of it, maybe 85% by the end. And I was also just psyched to have the opportunity to do it. So I didn't let it bother me too much after the beginning.
Is there opportunity in the future to do more writing for you, or are you really more passionate and more interested in the editing side of things? Or was that a fun project that you'd like to duplicate maybe in the similar topic? Is beer still an interest to you, or potentially something else in a similar situation, like a professional writing job with something else?
That's a complicated question. Beer is definitely of interest to me. I feel like I can't go into like beer journalism or anything because I just don't have the background. I don't have a journalistic background. I don't have that depth of beer knowledge. I think I'm always going to be just enthusiastic, nerdy beer snob. I mean, that was the other thing. The whole time I was writing this book, I would just like I was a font of beer facts. I guess I said that. Editing is how I make a living. And at the moment, it doesn't seem like I can make a living writing. It occurred to me I thought about pursuing other gift books or other, professional books like that. And I did actually have a journal of writing prompts, which was almost as fun as the beer book. And that actually, there was a whole publishing thing. It never got published. And so probably I'm going to put that back out on the market at some point. In my creative work, I definitely want to get published in a book. And I want to write a book. I've written a book. I want to publish a book. The process is really different. You query agents. Mm-hmm. They ignore you. It's very demoralizing. And so I had a book out for query for 2 years, and I've scaled back on it because it's really dependent on the market. And it's a memoir, and memoirs aren't, if you're just sort of an average human being, aren't selling so great right now. So I've scaled back on that, and I'm working on some essays that I would like eventually to put into a book. If I weren't working a full-time job now, I would definitely pursue other professional writing opportunities because, like I said, it was super fun, and it was sort of it was very creative, even though it wasn't, my life work, or it was just very rewarding.
I can certainly imagine. You touched on a little bit, if someone were to go the route of getting their own actual text that they're interested or passionate about, getting that published, that is a different beast. You said, is it fair to say, I guess, nowadays, like, you have to go through a literary agent? Is self-publishing, is that, I mean, I hear people talk about that. Is that still is it a viable option if you want to?
More than ever.
Yeah.
So sort of two ways to get traditionally published. If you're kind of nobody, you try to do it through an agent, and you query an agent. It's this very short, very stressful, very formulaic letter. How do you? Here's 65,000 words that you've just poured your like blood and sweat and tears into. Could you just sum it up in 2 sentences that have like a hook? It's difficult. Yeah, so you either approach an agent, or sometimes if you have, what happens a lot of the time is you have an essay that, or a short story that people are interested in, or goes viral, or the literary equivalent of viral, meaning some people read it. Agents look at that and they'll approach you, like, do you have a book? Are you interested in a book? And then they'll sometimes acquire you. With smaller presses, you can approach them directly, depending on the press. And, here's the book I have. Some books, you do book proposals. Memoirs and novels, you just like, here's the book. Do you like it? So, but there is also a lot of people do self-publish, and it used to be a really dirty word or dirty phrase, and meant that you were, your grandma was going to buy it, and it was like the production values were terrible, and there were misspellings, and that certainly does happen. But there are a lot of models that are a lot more professional and viable, and then, but it's kind of on you then to market the book.
Right.
I'm way too much of an introvert to take a book and get it everywhere.
Sell
like
it.
if I, there's also hybrid publishing where I forget how it works. It really depends on where you are, but there is some kind of like, maybe you put up some money, but they give you sort of this professional production. They have editors, they have layout people. So you might have a much better looking book, but you would still have to do more work necessarily than you might have to do in traditional publishing. So a literary agent kind of looks out for you and approaches the editors and helps you negotiate a contract, and sometimes helps you edit your book. And it's just kind of your book business person and their cheerleader. I don't have an agent, but his stories, you cry on the shoulder because it's not selling, like they're there to help the writer write the correct book that they can place somewhere. And it's kind of like a real estate agent. They don't get paid until they sell your book. Yeah.
Well, this is a wealth of knowledge, Ellen. I mean, I'm going to shift just a little bit as we're coming pretty close to our hour mark, and we want to be respectful of your time, of course. Well, you live in Southern Vermont, which is a pretty cool place for the craft beer renaissance or revolution of the United States. Can you tell us a little bit about the state? Did you say your favorite style was a stout originally, and it still is? Is that what you said?
Originally it was a stout. I have now fallen completely for New England IPAs.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I was going to say you have to like this.
I have to. That was even before I moved here. You know what I mean? When I moved here, someone said to us, "You never know who you're going to find in these woods." And I think that's really true in Vermont. You have, especially in Southern Vermont, it's not very populous, and people, it's sort of a trendy, a cool place. Not trendy, it's not really trendy, but like it's a destination. Like, you've heard of Vermont, you probably don't know anything about New Hampshire, which is right next to Vermont and has many similarities, but Vermont is sort of a brand, and I don't really know why that is. So people will just move there and start breweries, or people born there start breweries. But there's this really interesting mixture of rural and working class, and sometimes still working class, but more artisanal minded, with like craft beer and cheese is a big thing, maple syrup, obviously. And so it's just a really, really interesting place to live because of all these different, and it all kind of works together most of the time. There's not like, I don't know. I mean, there's conflict everywhere. But so, yeah, we have a lot of, there are also like a lot of farmers, and there's a lot of sort of a local food movements and sustainability and all of that. I don't know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, it's very, I mean, it's not too far from Canada either.
No, I don't live on the Canadian end, but it's a small
pretty
state.
close. Yeah, of course. Yeah, no, I don't think I've ever been to Vermont, but I might have driven through it, but not a worthwhile stay. But it definitely is very interesting, particularly now. I know a lot of craft breweries across the state are fantastic, and the New England IPA craze and the East Coast IPA. So
well, actually, one of the best, I had sort of like 3 beers that I thought was kind of like the standout Vermont beers. And some of them are the first one's totally obvious, which is Heady Topper, because it was super famous a while back because it was very rare. These hippies in Waterbury, Vermont, they were sometimes open. They would sometimes brew, and then they wouldn't. And it was completely unpredictable. So it became this like extremely desirable thing. And it was one of those beers people traveled for.
Right.
Don't tell anyone. I'm not a huge fan. It's definitely good. It's definitely interesting. My brother-in-law likes me probably just because I bring him that every Christmas. It's a very, very complex beer, and it's quality. Like I can tell it's good. It's just not to my taste. And so the other brewery, the one I really want to go to but haven't yet, because it's like 2 hours from everywhere. It's just in the Northeast Kingdom, which is bordering Canada, of course, and it's just remote. Is the Hill Farmstead Brewery is what it is.
Farmstead, yeah.
Yeah, and it's like one of the top breweries in the country, according to Rate Beer. And I've had their beers at a brew pub around here, and they're amazing. A lot of farmhouse beers. They're all named after their ancestors. There's Abner and Susan, and like all of these old-fashioned names. It's really cool. They have an amazing beers, and I would love to get there. Unfortunately, my spouse doesn't drink, and so he's not like, yeah, let's drive 3 hours to a brewery.
Right.
Whatever. He has other qualities.
I have a bit of the same problem in my home too. Yeah. Yeah. Well, Ellen, we're coming pretty close, but I do want to get my final question in before we stop. Stuff every beer snob should know. What was your favorite part and the most meaningful part of writing this text?
One of the things I learned writing this text is that people come to beer for really different reasons. Like we were saying, the people who have degrees in chemistry, brew, and what really draws me, this is gonna be a long answer.
That's okay.
So I first started drinking beer kind of regularly and getting into craft beer when I first moved to Boston. I was in my 20s. Most people have really turbulent, complicated 20s where they don't know what's going on, and there's just a lot of stuff. And so I just spent a lot of time with my friends. All of them liked different kinds of beers, and we would start out like talking about the beer, and then of course a beer in, you start talking about everything that's complicated and turbulent about your life. And so it was just a really lovely time. No, it was a terrible time, but this is one of the really good things about that time, was just sitting in these bars with my friends, drinking interesting beer and talking about it. And I don't know if you always get like a crowd of women talking about beer. My friends were mostly women. We were mostly all talking about beer. So I don't know if that was another thing that we all thought was cool. And then we also, with my writing friends, talked about writing. So beer and writing, like all of the good things. And so while there was a lot of bad stuff happening to me at the time, those two things were the good things that were happening. So that community is a lot of what I like about craft beer. But what I liked about writing the book, that was total aside. But what I liked writing about the book, what I found interesting, was also a sense of place. I was so interested in that all these different styles of beers in Europe, well, all over the world, really, developed because of the conditions, the temperatures. Pilsners were made because of the low mineral content of the water. So the water, nowadays, I think it was Dogfish Head was like, oh, we can just recreate any kind of water these days, which I also think is cool. But I love that kind of sense of place. People talk about a terroir of wine, but I really feel a terroir of beer, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Just sort of the harvest and the location and the temperature and the kind of water they have affected the kind of beer they made in each place. And I find that really interesting. And I know, nowadays that's less of a thing, but even so, regional beer is so interesting. You got your hazy New England IPAs that I adore, and your aggressive West Coast IPAs, and it's all kind of associated with place, and I find that very interesting. So place and community is kind of what brought me into it.
I think that's very well said. I think that I can definitely relate to that too. Beer is just so international too. It touches every corner of the globe in different ways. It's remarkable how this particular beverage just became third most consumed beverage after water and tea, but not too bad. Yeah. Well, Alan, that hour flew by, and I really do appreciate your time. And I learned a lot about publishing, about writing, about craft beer, about Vermont. Definitely want to visit. So we'll have to do this again. I'd love to pick your brain a little bit more about all of these topics. But in the meantime, I just want to say thank you. Stuff every beer snob should know. You should definitely pick up this lovely little book. I found, again, I don't have the physical book, but the online version, I went through it and learned a lot. There's a lot of great stuff in there. It's very pocket-sized and ready to take with you wherever you want to go. So Ellen, I really appreciate your time and look forward to chatting with you again soon.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all our interviews and beer-related content. Remember, craft beer is here.